they would probably say inventors. So Thomas Edison in the light bulb, or Tim Berners-Lee in the World Wide Web. Or they might go one step beyond that and say, well, how about the builders of the big tech firms? So Thomas J. Watson at IBM, or Bill Gates at Microsoft, or Steve Jobs at Apple, and so on. Of course, the latter two did both some invention and some firm building, but these are the kinds of figures that people think of when they think of technology heroes. But I want to propose a different set of heroes tonight, and one that will seem pretty odd to many people initially. I want to propose standard setters and builders of standards organizations as heroes of global technology. And I'm going to talk tonight about these three men. Yes, I know they're all men and all white, and I'll come back to that at the end a bit, but these are some heroes who helped establish the organizations that make our world as it operates today possible. Let me step back for a second and give you some context before I start talking about these individuals. All of this is based on Engineering Rules, which is our new book, which I wrote together. This is the first time my husband and I collaborated. This is Craig Murphy. He's going to peek in for a second.
Hi, it's good to see you. Hi, Jean.
And in this book, we trace three waves of standard setting. The first wave started in the late 19th century and went up to World War II. And it was a period of creating national standards bodies and the first international bodies. The second wave was from World War II to the 1980s, late 1980s. And that was a period dominated by the growth of international standards and the expansion of global markets. And finally, the third wave started in the late 1980s and comes to the present and was characterized most obviously by the standardizing of the internet, but also by several other things as well. So why do we even care about standards in the first place? It's worth stepping back a step and thinking about that before we jump into what I'm going to talk about, because standards shape the infrastructure of all global technology. If you look at the screw threads on the bolt in the upper left corner of the visual, the screw threads on that have been a subject of standardization since the mid-19th century and clear past World War II. Getting screw threads that are compatible with nuts and bolts, etc., it turns out to be a critical factor for all kinds of technology, for the beams, the steel beams that go to make the towers that carry our electricity, if you look at the top right of the slide, or even something as mundane as the screw threads on your garden hose. Without standards, if I walked into a store and bought a new hose, how would I know it would fit the faucet on the outside of my house? I wouldn't, except for the fact that there are standards. But little things like screws aren't the only things that are standardized. Electrical connections, for example, in the upper center of the slide, you see a plug-in for an electric car, one that is very important in the most recent waves of technology, and all the connectors we use to connect our phones. All of those are critical to our technology today. And there's another whole set of standards that are unseen. Many of you probably know about IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. You see its logo there, but its standards are software standards. We can't see them, but without them, we wouldn't be having this Zoom session together, because a technology like Zoom builds on all of those internet standards, without which we couldn't do all this. So standards are critical to all of this global technology. But tonight, I'm not going to focus on the standards themselves, but instead on the people and the processes that underlie it and that make this all possible for us. And just to give you sort of a sense of the piece of it that I focus on, in the book and in this talk, I focus on the private voluntary consensus-based piece of standardization. if we think about standards as on a continuum, at one end you have the market, where you have standards wars between firms, such as the ones over VHS and Betamax, or the various kinds of high definition DVDs. On the other end, you have government regulations, mandated standards. So the N95 masks that many people are trying to get hold of for the coronavirus first responders, those masks are actually a government standard through NIOSH. But that's fairly rare, as it turns out, because governments, the US government and other democratic governments, don't actually like setting their own standards. So in between these two opposing poles, both of which are somewhat slow and may not come out with a standard that makes much sense to the actual players in the market, in between, this whole world of private consensus-based standards has grown up. These are standards that are set in private associations. Sometimes it's professional or trade associations like the IEEE or the Society for Automotive Engineers. Often it's in national standards bodies, such as ANSI for the US, or in international bodies like ISO. And finally, for the newest round of standards in our world, global bodies like the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, or W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. So this center part, there's some out here with the markets, there's some over here with the regulation, but there's a huge amount here in the center that goes on. I want to pause for a second here and ask you if you can find the thing that allows you to raise your hand, if you've been involved in standardization. Have you ever served on a standardization committee? Well, they're going up fast. Okay. 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so quite a few of you have had the experience of serving on one of these committees. That's good, because this will give you some context for this. For those of you who haven't served on one and been involved, let me just quickly do a very quick summary of what the process looks like. As we've said, they're in private non-governmental bodies, like the ones I just listed. The members are typically firms, professional societies, and government departments, and engineers usually represent them. Now, this is not true for IETF, which is a big exception on this. IETF has individual members, but all the national bodies and so on typically have firms and societies and trade associations and government departments as members. The standards themselves are hashed out on committees that are called technical committees. And these technical committees are required by most of the traditional organizations like this to be balanced. And balanced in this case means they have to have producer firms, they have to have user firms, and they have to have the general interest. And all three of those have to be represented. And no one of them can be more than 50%, can be 50% or more. That's to keep any one constituency from railroading a standard through. The process that they go through is incredibly long and painstaking, as you know if you've been on one of these committees. It takes a huge amount of work and patience, and it strives for as complete a consensus as is possible. It tries to get to the point where at least, if everyone isn't enthusiastic about the standard, at least no one is opposed to it violently. And there's a reason why they need to keep working until they get to that point of consensus. And that is that these standards are voluntarily adopted by stakeholders. So in order to get everyone to buy in, they have to make sure they get everyone's input. Without that, they wouldn't have that many people following the standard. Now, governments can and often do, point to standards in legislation, and then they become mandatory. But in the first instance, in this kind of voluntary consensus standardization, stakeholders voluntarily adopt them. Okay, all of that is by way of background. Now we come to our unsung heroes. And tonight I'm going to focus particularly on a type of person that in the book we call standardization entrepreneurs. These are the people who built and championed the organizations and the processes for voluntary standards and have been doing so since 1900. And without them, our technical world would look far different. I don't know how we could have the level and intensity of technology that we have today that has to be compatible if we didn't have someone doing the standard setting. So these people are critically important to our technological world. And I'm going to talk about three of them, one from each wave, starting with perhaps our favorite figure in this book, Charles LaMasse, who was an evangelist of national and international standardization in the first wave. And he was, when I use the term evangelist, I mean it actually in the modern day sense. He really was the cheerleader and the person who supported and spread this whole notion of this way of setting standards. So LaMasse himself was born in the Channel Islands between Britain and France in a bicultural and bilingual setting, and that ended up being quite important for him because international standardization depends heavily on someone being able to work across cultural lines and across language lines. He was an electrical engineer by training, and in 1901, when the first national standards body was formed in Great Britain, he became the lower level, the undersecretary, you might call it, although that wasn't officially his title, of that standards body. So there was a higher level general secretary, and then he served under him. He actually, by World War I, he became the general secretary because the initial general secretary was on a ship during World War I that got sunk in the hostilities. So he came to his position in that during World War II. Excuse me. And in that capacity as the general secretary of the British national body, he went around and spread this process. He taught other countries. He went to other countries, explained to them how they set it up, and helped them get their own setup. So he went to lots of Commonwealth countries. So, Australia and New Zealand and Canada. But he also was very happy to work with the US group, which was formed during World War I. He crossed over twice and helped them get the US started on its process. He also was very active in the French system and getting the Soviets started as well, and other countries as well. So he was very active in encouraging other national societies to form, and he even called together all the secretaries of these societies periodically to meet. LaMasse also served as an ambassador in international standard setting. Here he was in particular focused in the electrical domain. The International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, was founded in 1906, so it was very early, and it still exists today. We'll come back to it. It's still important today. He became the general secretary from its founding in 1906 until his death in 1953. So he had almost 50 years of heading up the IEC, and in that capacity, again, he did even more international work, traveling the world because they tended to meet in different countries of the world, and he continued to spread the notion of standardization even farther. He was, in essence, one of the leaders, maybe the most important leader of a movement of spreading this standardization. This picture shows you the International Electrotechnical Commission meeting in Turin in 1911. And the arrow shows you LeMaistre himself. LeMaistre also was a catalyst in the formation of the first attempt at a broader, not just electricity, but a broader international standards body between the wars, although he didn't head it up for reasons that will become clear. But in 1926, he led the heads of the European national bodies to the US. This is LeMaistre again, leading this contingent of standard setters coming off a ship from Europe to the US. They were coming for two meetings. One was an IEC meeting, but the other was a meeting of representatives of all the national committees to talk about whether they should start a broad international body. As a result of that meeting, within a couple years, the first international standards body that was not limited to a specific domain, indeed was established, the ISA. The ISA did face some difficulties, however. It was limited by strife between inch and metric countries. In fact, there was a struggle from the very beginning because the continental European countries, Germany and France particularly, thought that it did not make any sense to have countries like the US and England in it with their inches unless they converted to metric too. They felt that everything should be done in metric. And because of this strife, actually, LeMaistre was not chosen to be, or he withdrew from consideration to be the Secretary General of this body. And perhaps in part because of that, the body did not achieve very much during this interwar period. And when World War II broke out, it was mothballed and it never truly emerged. During the time it did exist, though, it was dominated by the Germans and other continental powers. LeMaistre's last phase of service to international standards setting actually occurred right at the beginning of the second wave after World War II, and it involved the establishment of the ISO, or International Organization for Standardization, in 1946. He helped a coalition of the victors, the standardizers representing the victorious countries, to found ISO. And one of the reasons that ISA never came out of receivership, essentially, is that A, it was dominated by the Germans, and B, it was the secretary who had mothballed it for that period was a Swiss German who was a Nazi sympathizer. So there were reasons why they decided not to start it as a revival of ISA, but to instead take a group of standardizers, a coalition of standardizers for the Allied countries as the beginning of it. Nevertheless, even though they didn't want to start it, to form it around Germany, they also considered it important to include countries like Germany ultimately. The movement for standardization was a very internationalist movement. And indeed, oh, here they are in 1946. Excuse me, I should have shown you that a minute ago. And the arrow shows you LeMaistre. He's in his 70s by now, so he's a tiny little, you can just see his head between two taller people there. But his big contribution here was that he really worked hard diplomatically to get Germany brought into ISO. Initially, it wasn't brought in, but it wasn't in on the formation, but he worked hard with the Allied countries to get them to recognize Germany's national standards body again, and he managed to get them brought back into ISO, into the standards world, a couple of years before they were accepted into the UN. He died in 1953, and after he achieved this, getting Germany back in, and he was remembered and eulogized as the father of international standardization, and he was the most important figure of standardization in the first half of the 20th century. Now, let me move on to the second wave, and a key figure in that, Ole Steren. Ole Steren, who is the gentleman on the right, was a Swedish engineer. He actually was also a tennis player, and his engineering was around kitchen engineering. But he had an interesting career in which he gradually moved into standards, initially because he was working for the UN, and he helped establish a national standards body in Turkey. And by doing that, he became convinced that standardization was a good thing. And when he went back to Sweden, he became involved in standardization there. And soon he had risen to head the Swedish body for standards. And as the head of the Swedish body, he helped form, and later headed briefly, the first European standards body, CEN. And then he moved from that on up to become Secretary General of ISO from 1969 to 1986. This is the longest term of any Secretary General of the ISO, and he had a huge impact on ISO in his time there. There are really three major contributions or achievements he made during that time in forwarding international standardization. First, he really accelerated the setting of international standards. The American and the British predecessors to him, there were two people before he became Secretary General, and they were not very good. They were not very good at pushing the agenda. So there might be 10 standards set a year. His goal was for hundreds of standards to be set a year, because he believed that an industrialized country needed 20,000 standards to function, and 10,000 of those should be international. So he thought it was critical to accelerate that process, and he did so. He also brought into the ISO national standards bodies from developing countries in Africa and Asia. Here you see Steren himself and his wife Nali in China in 1978. This is just after Deng Xiaoping has become the head, and they are celebrating his bringing China into the ISO. So the People's Republic of China was brought in 78, and he was the key person who did that. So he brought in China and many other countries from all over the world into that. His third major achievement was to make standards a matter of proactive strategy rather than just reactions to needs, immediate needs. So, for example, he was the person first for Sweden and then in ISO who drove the international standardization of containers for intermodal shipping. And containers, the standardization of containers was perhaps the most successful case of standardization during this period. It had a huge impact on the world. It created the global market in many respects. Relatively recently, an economist has done an in-depth panel study that actually shows that the effect of the container standard on growing the global market was greater than that of the GATT or the WTO. So it was hugely influential in making our market global. He also established the committees to set standards for computers and for the environment. early, before it was clear how much need there would be for this. So he got ISO on top of those issues early on. Basically, you can attribute to Stern the engine of growth for the global economy that standards became. ISO became a critical factor in the global economy and in its growth. And Stern was really the major figure behind making it that. Okay, now we come into the contemporary era and into MIT as well, with Tim Berners-Lee, who we saw earlier as a standards inventor, but he's also a standardization entrepreneur. And let me just say briefly before we go into Tim Berners-Lee that I'm skipping over, I'll make a couple of mentions of IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, but there's not a single figure that's as central to that as Tim Berners-Lee is to W3C. So I'm focusing on it in the contemporary era. So as you probably know, he developed the basic elements of the web, URLs and HTTP, when he was at CERN, the European Physics Lab. And if you look at this image captured from a video from the London Olympics in 2012, the opening ceremonies, you see at the bottom of it, it says, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web. But he did more than invent it. The second step was that he convinced CERN to release it to the world, not to copyright it, not to make it proprietary, but to release it to the world. And that was critical. But the most critical piece of this, from my point of view, at least, is that rather than setting up his own firm to exploit this thing he had come up with, he formed a body to standardize it instead. And this was a very important step. He created W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, to set standards for the web. And by the way, you probably know that he sits at MIT now, and one of the three international centers for the World Wide Web Consortium is at MIT. So it was a new kind of standards organization. It was on the one hand, it was a consortium, but it also had a voluntary consensus orientation. So corporate consortia typically are not balanced and are not consensus oriented. They're typically formed on the basis of 3 to 5 companies from the producer side of something who come together and agree on a common standard. And even though consortium is in the name here, this was never that kind of one-sided focused body. It has a huge array of members who come from not just producer firms, but also user firms and organizations and nonprofits of all kinds. It has dues, which consortia always do, but it has them on a sliding scale so that, an IBM pays a huge amount, but a small developing country or a nonprofit pays a pretty small amount. And W3C tries hard to follow the consensus process developed by LaMasse and the earlier standardizers. But there is one twist to W3C compared to the other standards bodies I've talked about. And that is that Tim Berners-Lee himself retains key powers that, it's surprising. So he personally approves the chair of every committee. He personally decides when a standard has reached a point where it can be voted on as a standard. And if there is an appeal to a standard, the appeal goes to him. Now, he has been accused on occasion of trying to set himself up as a monarch, but he insists that he's a benevolent one and he tries to stay out of it as much as he can. And in fact, it's true that the World Wide Web Consortium has fought the balkanization of the internet that he feared. The reason he went for the standards body was that he was afraid the World Wide Web would become balkanized, and he wanted to make sure that the web was for everyone. which is what he was celebrated for at the 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony. This is for everyone. So BernersLee is a little different from the previous two standardizers in that he actually moved from the inventor category to the standardization entrepreneur category. But I think that is actually a very critical step and one that he should be honored for. So we have looked at three technology heroes who built today's standards organization. The IEC, which LaMasse built, is still with us today and still active, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Ostern made the ISO what it is today, and BernersLee created W3C. Another way to look at IEC that may remind some of you who don't think you recognize it of what it is, you might know it from this logo. ISO IEC JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1, is the Information Technology Standards Committee that crosses those two, and that is responsible for things like the MPEG standard and smart card standards. So they're very much still part of the standards world today. So my focus tonight has been on the standardization entrepreneurs, the engineers who built and spread the organizations and the processes for standards. But I actually would argue that there are other standards heroes. The leaders who chair the technical committees. You know, I learned a lot about this in working on the book, and they have to work incredibly hard, and they have to have incredible patience to work on this consensus process over long periods of time. And any standardizer, any engineer who has served on a technical committee also has done hard work and has had to travel to different locations to meet, and that travel is not touristical travel, as LaMasse used to say. It was, in fact, travel to a location to sit down in a hotel room and just work on standards. So all of these people are heroes in my eye. But I want to ask the question, what will tomorrow's standardization heroes look like? To figure that out, it's important to look at something going on in standard setting today. There are beginning to be shortages of standard setting in some of the more traditional areas. During the 20th century, standardizers were typically white males from Western developed countries. But those men are graying, and in some cases, they're having problems replacing them. If it's a new, exciting area of technology, young people will come in. But in some of the more traditional ones, it's harder to get people to come in to replace them. For example, one chapter of our book talks about standardization of EMC, electromagnetic compatibility, which used to be called radio frequency interference. That's something that is important still today. Our phone devices and everything else, everything can interfere. My clicker here could interfere with things. Anything can interfere. And so a lot still has to be managed on that front, but it doesn't sound as exciting to a lot of younger engineers. So they have a hard time replacing them. And one of the issues may be that they need to open out the pool that they're drawing from. There are some signs of change, however. Some standards organizations are attempting to increase diversity. So, for example, the IETF pays for a set of people from developing countries and representing various countries, ethnicities, and genders to attend their meetings, so that it's not just the ones who are paid by their companies who can attend. In addition, some new areas in which standard setting is going on are more attractive, apparently, to women. So ISO is now very much involved in social responsibility and environmental standardization, an area that does attract more women. So, and we can also see that even beyond ISO, Alice Tepper Marlin was the founder of a non-ISO body, social that created a standard, Social Accountability International, SAI 8000, for labor standards in the third world. And the environmental ISO 26000 environmental social responsibility working group was co-chaired by Brazil and Sweden and included as many women as men. So all of these are suggestions that the broadening of the pool that we really need to happen to fill the jobs that are the standardization positions that are so central, we need that to be happening. And so the bringing more people in from around the world and women in as well should help with that. So we can hope that tomorrow's standardization heroes will in fact look more diverse. But I think we also know that they're going to be as important as ever to technology in our world. It's very hard to see how we function successfully in a world as completely surrounded by technology as ours is, and as dependent on compatibility as ours is, without this standardization happening. So I would urge you to join me in in the process of writing this book. I have come to really look up to and respect and honor these standardization heroes for their role in global technology. We could come up with things that are wrong with standardization, and I know many of those, but without these people, we wouldn't have the world we have today. So I hope you will join me in honoring them, and I now invite your questions.
Okay. We've got a few questions in the Q&A box.
Okay.
So let's see. This is so just going in order. From Anonymous, was there a particular event that led to the creation of the UK Standards Commission?
Okay, so it's a very interesting story. It's not so much an event as an underlying reality of the world at that point. The reason we believe that the UK was the first one to form this is that they had their empire to worry about, and they wanted standards not just for the UK itself, but for the whole empire. For India, railroads in India, for example, was part of what they wanted standards for. It had to do with railroad rails, actually. The specific thing that started them going was a desire to standardize steel rails, but those steel rails would be used not just in England itself, but in the empire.
Okay. So we've got a couple of questions from Will Roberts. Would you like to unmute and ask a question? Can I undo that?
Maybe share your camera too.
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Okay. Be able to. Rejoining. Okay. Wait.
Do you have another one on the Q&A? Oh, here he comes.
Okay. Are you there, Will?
He's still muted.
Okay.
I think the host has to unmute.
Yes, I thought I did that. Okay. Oh, of course, that's why. There we go. Yep.
No?
All right. That's still not. Okay, back to plan A. we'll work on it. We'll just go to the next one. From Mark Nahabedian, IETF standards documents have been free and readily available for as long as I've been aware of them. It's been a long time since I wanted to read an ISO standard, but when I did, they were outrageously expensive. Can you comment on this dichotomy?
Yes, so let me talk about this. So it's very interesting. For the whole period up until the founding of the IETF, all of those standards bodies around the world, they were not funded by the government, and they weren't funded by companies. They were funded by very tiny dues, and they made money by selling the standards. So that was true throughout the world for, from the beginning of the 20th century on through. But when IETF came along, it did not grow out of the same tradition, actually, as all the other standard setting bodies. It grew out of a completely different background in the US government. And when it got started, it had no idea of being like a traditional standards organization. So from the very start, it was dealing with software, and it was sharing freely all its standards. And I think pretty much everyone would agree that being able to share standards for free is a wonderful thing. There's still lots of organizations, though, who do not have a business model that allows them to do that. And without that, it's hard for them to survive. So that's been a big challenge to the ISO for a long time. And actually, they sell standards much cheaper to people, to countries, to other countries, to companies in third world countries, for example. They have all kinds of special deals for that. But ideally, everyone would have standards for free. So I agree that IETF is good for that. But it came at the right time. It didn't start under the same rules, and it had a way to circulate things for free. So it was the first one to start that process. W3C, of course, has free standards as well.
Okay. Okay, and another question. Let's see. In a consensus from Pauly D, in consensus processes, do larger firms tend to dominate the results? After all, they might have more ability to finance the background work and to be able to afford to send people to the meetings.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. Ironically, in a way, large companies have more ability to influence IETF because, for example, Microsoft could send, because there's no membership in IETF, they could send, hundreds of engineers to a meeting, and they could have an impact on that. The background, the point about the background research is important, and it is true that large companies have more ability to do research along their lines, and that's absolutely true. But they have to be able to convince enough people on all sides of the issue to take it. I think my husband Craig wants to stick his head in and add something here.
In the traditional, sorry, I'm not in. In the traditional organizations like the German Standardization Board or BSI, the British Standardization Board, you always have representatives of supposedly the general interest, which tend to be representatives, people from academic institutions, who also often are in a position to have a great deal of research backing them. So yeah, the big companies have a big advantage there, but they don't get, in those organizations, they don't get more voice than just the company themselves. And often they're balanced by the academic groups. But yes, that is the bias.
Yeah. And just to bring back one other thing that I said earlier, it's not that standardization is perfect by any means, and there are sources of influence in the system. But when you think about it, overall, I mean, we spent 10 years studying this, and we ended up with the feeling that, in fact, it's amazing so much good work is done by the standards organizations, and how important it's been to all of us that it has been done, and how many people of goodwill actually are part of this process. So yes, there are examples you can come up with that where there's been too much influence from a given company, but they don't dominate the whole picture. And one thing that I think is very true is that in most cases, a standard, it's important to have a standard, whether, even if it's not the very best standard, technically, it can, it's never going to be the best standard technically necessarily. It's the one you can get people to agree on. And any standard is better than no standard. That's one of the sort of underlying beliefs of this whole movement. Look, I would like to share one other slide, and then I can take down my slides, but I just couldn't bear not to show this. I didn't mention one person who is a critical connection between MIT and standardization, who is Oliver Smoot, who graduated from MIT in 1962. Does anyone in here in this audience know Smoot? If so, raise your hand virtually. Ah, two for, oh, 5. Wow, okay. So,
yes.
Okay, so 8. Lots of you know who he is. So
yeah.
He is
a standard.
He is a standard. He was I've entitled this slide "Chosen Early by Standardization" because he was, when he was a student, his body was used to measure the Mass Avenue Bridge, and you can see him in the left-hand picture being laid out repeatedly across the Mass Avenue Bridge. And later in his life, he became the chair of ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, in the early 2000s, and then immediately after that, the president of ISO. So MIT has had a long
5.7.
Yeah, has had a long relationship with standards.
I just turned my video back on to share that I got this a few years ago from MIT's Moving Day. Of course, it's in mirror image. But
yes,
the tape measure, the measure of one.
In Smoot, yeah.
In Smoot, yes.
So
fabulous.
Yes.
So I will stop sharing that now.
One ear. So,
me instead, but yes, Smoot's
it's a very, very popular, popular item.
Yeah, I'd love to have one of those.
Well, we'll have to see what we can arrange with
kind of swag.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we do still have a few more questions here. It's a good one. Yeah. Speaking of any standards better than no standard. Fairly early in the IT standards process, the idea was introduced of anticipatory standards, ones that tried to get ahead of technologies rather than representing consensus of the common practice. Various analyses have claimed that it was critically important, others that it caused far more problems than it solved. What are your thoughts on this trade-off?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
we've got plenty of time. None of us are going anywhere, so.
So we did think a lot about that issue. You want to come over and for a second?
Oh my gosh.
Anticipatory standards were sort of, in some sense, they were the downfall of the iOS standard that was attempted by ISO.
And it was maybe one of the stupidest things that Ole Stern supported. Although whether it's stupid or not, it still might be the stupidest thing. Anyway, never mind.
Anyway, but the TCPIP, which is the connector that ended up dominating the internet, became a de facto standard because this iOS standard that they were trying to create in ISO to inter-network computers was an anticipatory standard, and it went on for years and years and years and years with all these aspects of it, and they never, basically at a certain point, the de facto standard just became standard because they couldn't get to a coherent standard.
But it became a research program too. I mean, it became a way of thinking about the process of creating the internet, and it was useful in that sense. So it wasn't useful to actually create the standards, but it was useful to think about what the whole thing was that they were working on. How about that?
And I would also add that anticipatory standards, so it's interesting. The proactive stance that Ostern took, it has a certain relationship with anticipatory standards. If you want to get ahead of the game a little bit, you may need to do that. So let me give you an example where we didn't, and we all suffer for it still. Anyone who travels to internationally is faced constantly with the problem of carrying around a converter, right? That has all those different plugs on it. Well, why can they not arrive at an international standard for plugs? The problem was that the national levels had standardized during the war, but World War I before, and they didn't make an attempt to turn it into an international standard till much later. And by that time, every country had the standard built out, and no one wanted to change their own. No country was willing to change its own standard. So that was a case where if they if someone had undertaken at the international level, if IEC had undertaken an anticipatory standard, they might have gotten out ahead of it. So it really is a trade-off. And
there's kind of an art to figuring out whether this technology is at a stage where there aren't going to be significant improvements.
Right.
And Stern, who wasn't necessarily a great engineer, although he was a great organizer of a committee and that sort of thing, he was pretty good at figuring out, except with the internet, he was pretty good at figuring out that even though we don't have the whole industry in place, for example, with the containerization, the technologies aren't going to get much better in terms of what those containers are like. So we really should push to get agreement among all the people who are making different containers to do this right then. So there is an art about choosing when you're going to sort of decide something should be made to standardization.
Got a couple of questions from Will Roberts. Tried to unmute him and it wasn't working. So one question: what are the differences between generally accepted proprietary standards, the Centronix parallel printer interface, proprietary standards like GIF and PDF, and recommended standards like RS 232? And another question, speaking of international standards, something we'd all like to know: how did the UK, Commonwealth, and Japan settle on driving on the left and everyone else on the right?
That one I'm not going to try to answer, actually, because we focused on this on industrial standards. So that's a behavioral standard, essentially. I mean, a set of industrial standards come out of that because you have to engineer the cars differently, different size, but it's essentially a behavioral standard to get it to tell you which side to be on. So proprietary standards versus so proprietary standards that then became commonly accepted are ones that won in a standards war, or it's not always a full-fledged war. They won in the market, and if they win out quickly in the market, then there's nothing wrong with that. But it often is a long and expensive battle, as it was in some famous cases. So if someone establishes a standard and everyone starts adopting it because it's the best, so TCPIP, it wasn't proprietary, but it was adopted because it seemed to work, and nothing else did. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the real problem is getting interconnectivity between everything, and sometimes that takes the process of the standardization process to get to that point. If it can happen through the market and quickly, then I think that's a good thing for the world. I think from the consumer point of view, what's desirable is something that works well and that everyone can use. and that's basically what all of us want. All of us want to not have to have that converter with us when we go to other countries. So USB, that is another good example of a standard that is not done by these voluntary consensus standards making societies. It's done by a consortium. So there are some important standards where a consortium came up with it, and then it was widely enough adopted quickly enough that it became a de facto standard. So as long as we can get to something like that quickly, I don't see a real problem.
Okay. Slightly changing tack slightly, but what personality traits do these standard setters have in common? Do you think they have had a high emotional intelligence?
Yes. So actually, this is something we did spend some time thinking about, and because so the first of our three figures, LaMasse, was known for being a diplomat and for always putting himself behind and effacing. He was self-effacing and he never took credit for things, but he was behind the scenes being a diplomat through it all. And he was terrific at it and patient, and he would work forever on getting people together. So diplomacy and patience are both key factors and the same, I think, was true of Ostern. I think that you also, so I did, one chapter of the book was a close-up look at an electromagnetic compatibility set of standardizers, and one individual who sort of was the central person in that chapter had an incredible patience and an incredible ability to continue working on it again and again. He balloted the same standard like through 11 versions of the standard, including 4 separate ballotings on the 11th round, and he had to be willing to do it again and again and again. Look at all the answers, look at, could they narrow the distance between the different parties, come up with whatever might narrow that a little bit, try it again, do it again. So patience, I think, is huge. And tirelessness and a belief. I think they often had a very strong belief that this was good for the world, and therefore it was important for them to work on it, to be willing to work on it. I mean, I could not imagine having the patience that it would take to do some of this. Years and years to get these standards through. I mean, a typical standard goes through a committee in maybe 5 years, and some of them take way longer. So this is a really painstaking process.
The other thing that we haven't mentioned is that even of these 3 people, for most of the people, they have to be really good engineers. One of the things that I kind of like about Ostern as someone who's not an engineer is that he was an engineer, but he probably wasn't as good an engineer. He was a person who did modular kitchens and that sort of stuff. And his wife made fun of him because whenever they moved to a new place, like to Geneva or to Turkey or whatever, he would immediately decide that he had to redo the kitchen to make it look, IKEA-ish or something of that sort. And it was always awful. So, but the others are really good engineers too.
But I do think that there is a personality profile of the great standardizers, and it involves emotional intelligence,
great emotional
intelligence, patience, and belief. Really believing that this is important enough to put all this time and effort into.
Okay. Another question from Sarah Jensen. Thank you for the talk. And in the aviation world, we see a different problem. Too many US and international standards bodies and overlapping standards. Did any of the leaders you speak of do anything to address the increasing splitting of competing standards?
Yeah. So there are big problems with that in the US, actually more than in many other countries. The US has a particularly messy system of standards in which lots of bodies set standards in the same arena, and that's a problem. So there's ASTM, and someone just has put up
someone
there.
has asked
I
about
know mention of ASTM International. So ASTM is the materials testing engineers. That's their body, and that body actually is as old as some of these ones we talked about. In fact, I didn't talk about it, but there was an attempt for an international body of that type even before the ones I talked about, but it failed. It died during World War I. But out of that came ASTM. So right at the same time, ASTM was founded, it became ASTM in 1901 also, I believe. So, so it's from the same area. So it was, some of its standards overlap. But also all these professional societies and trade associations set standards in certain areas, and they all overlap. So the US has a very messy system because ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, was never given full hierarchical authority over all the things under it. If you look at BSI in Britain, everything else is underneath it. If you look at DIN in Germany, everything is very well organized. It's very clear what realm everybody can set standards in, and you cannot have overlap in the German system. So lots of countries in Europe in particular are much better organized, but the US system has always been much more laissez-faire, much more wide open. Anyone can try who wants to. And while we have a national standards body, in one sense, ANSI, and it represents us on ISO and in IEC, it does not have any authority over ASTM. And in fact, ironically, ASTM has now become ASTM International, and it sometimes works with ISO even. So yes, it's a very messy world of standards in the US particularly. And actually, I think we'd be better off if it weren't so messy.
Oh, yes. We're going to get into the political questions right now. Yeah, centuries ago, long before any technology was interchangeable, there were occasional interdenominational Christian councils to standardize on dogmatic issues, but hard to imagine anyone caring about, but somehow had huge political implications. Do you have any comments?
I don't know much about it.
It's a little outside.
So I will say one thing though. There's a process of, what is it, democratic, the process by which you get
deliberative democracy.
A consensus is something called deliberative democracy. It is a process of listening to every single person and getting the opinions of everyone, and that process is a more widespread, that component of it is more widespread. A lot of popular movements are based on a deliberative democracy kind of process. So there are some similarities in there.
And obviously the system is not perfect in terms of not being completely coherently organized, but the existence of a shared process, a deliberative process that is technocratically democratic, and that is to say it's democratic among consensus-oriented, among people who supposedly know what they're doing, means that if you have people who are committed to the idea that the system should become more coherent, and there are some people like that. There's a nice Swedish engineer, we saw a picture of her on one of the things, Kristen Sandberg, who I think feels like she is going to spend her life trying to create that process and make everything, just make all of the incompatibilities disappear. So we may have, 15, 25 years from now, we may be sitting around and saying this whole process works a lot better because there's been someone who's been, with her great diplomatic skills and her all of those other characteristics, has been working to make the process, which is shared, one that is also only producing a particular one set of standards. So
I see a question in the Q&A that I'd like to address.
Yep, sure.
Don Clemson asks, would you comment on ANSI's structure as an accreditor of standards development organizations rather than a standards producing body? So that's very interesting. it became an accreditor rather than the creator of standards in the second half of the 20th century, and in part because there was a case where ASME, the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, actually got sued for antitrust, right? And got triple damages against it because a technical committee chair erroneously, intentionally and erroneously said that something would not fit the standard that would fit the standard, and the result was that a small company went bankrupt, but they sued, and there were huge, it's the only one we were able to find, a case where they ran into antitrust difficulties, and this was because of someone who did not follow the rules and who was cheating. And because there was a huge fine to ASME, it made all kinds of organizations really nervous about being standards bodies. So there were a bunch of changes in who did what at that point. There was a reshuffling that happened then. And one of the things happened was that ANSI went from being a standard setting body with committees under it to being an accreditor of standard setting bodies. They created the standards for standard setting that you had to fulfill to become an American national standards, but they no longer created them themselves.
And it made the U.S. more different than it already was.
Right. And it also contributed to the messiness of the U.S. system as it was doing that. So it's actually a very interesting process that's happened.
Another question. Do you think that counter standards efforts, printer ink, coffee maker, cartridges, software interfaces using intellectual property expansion will create more proprietary standards and possibly undo some standards history?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that particular area to say, but let me say something about intellectual property, because we haven't really talked about that. And it's an interesting issue in all of this. In the earlier days of standardization, starting around 1900 and coming up until the 80s, really, for the most part, standards made by these standards bodies did not incorporate patents in them. I mean, they just did their best to avoid having patents be part of them. In fact, in the case of the containers, they managed to convince someone who owned the patent on the corners that hold together, the four corners, well, 8 corners of a container that attached them to each other. A company owned that standard, owned the intellectual property, sorry, not the standard yet, owned the patent. And in the process of turning it into an international standard, someone convinced him to give up the IP, to give up his patent right to those patents, so that it could become part of the standard. So patents weren't so very important as part of standards until really this phase 3, this third wave of standardization. That's when patents again suddenly became a real issue in standardization. And I'm not a lawyer, I don't know, I'm not a patent expert, but my sense is that when software became patentable, that was a huge incentive to start all these fights over patents and standards. And that's when things got very messy around intellectual property and standards. Before that, they just tried to work around it. And in fact, some of the bodies today, so W3C, for example, as part of its sort of pro-social stance in the world, does not allow companies to make money off patents that are in standards. If you're part of a standard setting process, you have to sign something saying that you won't. So patents are not part of W3C standards.
Can I say
Yes,
the Wang Ping story?
Yes, please.
So there's a standards guru in China. He's talk the people who work primarily on IT standards, but in other fields, consider a gentleman by the name of Wang Ping to be like the guy you should go and talk to about all the history of standardization in China and all sorts of other things. And Wang Ping has this argument where he says, you know, what's really happened with intellectual property and with consortia that create proprietary standards that are often based on trying to make money on intellectual property, that this has become a differentiation of another kind of social or governance realm. And it's a governance realm where companies that want to compete on trying to make their particular thing the standard are able to compete in that realm, whereas there are other realms where standardization is being done without that. And he says it seems perfectly sensible for both of those things to happen, because he says it's actually really hard for companies ever to make money by really trying to say, we are going to come up with this particular, know ahead of time that the thing that they've come up with is actually going to become a standard. That if you do it, you say you knew that you were doing that previously and all of that. But he says it's kind of a risky sort of thing. But the differentiation, he thinks, is just another differentiation of the governance systems, and probably doesn't have it, as long as engineers and companies know what they're doing and which realm they're working in, it doesn't cause any problems.
We're maybe just two more questions.
So I'm taking a look through the questions on the Q&A.
Okay, yeah, you can go ahead and.
Are about specific standards that we didn't study. It turns out the standards world is huge. We had no idea what we were getting into when we started this project. I cannot tell you how many realms there are in which there are standards. So you end up picking and choosing we chose sometimes by accident almost the standards that we studied. For example, the electromagnetic compatibility standards that we have a whole chapter on, we chose it because an archivist put us in touch with a very old standardizer in that area who wanted to get some of this down, and who connected us with other people who took us to other people, which brings up one of the most interesting aspects of the project for other historians and scholars. Finding the records for standard setting is really hard because no one collects them. It turns out that all of the traditional standards organizations up to IETF, when they started to have them online, those you can go back and get. But all the earlier ones, they don't collect the records of all the standards committees centrally. So ISO may have a committee and you say, oh, I want all the records from this committee. And they say, oh, we don't have them. Go talk to the secretariat. And let's say ANSI was the secretariat. So you go to ANSI and you say, do you have the records for this particular committee? And ANSI says, oh no, we farmed it out to one of our member committees, IEEE or something else. And then you go down another level. It turns out the only way to find these records, to find detailed records about specific cases of how a standard was set, is to get down to a chair of a committee. And in a couple of cases, in one case, a standardizer who we had been trying to get into touch with, we'd been told to talk to him. We had tried to set up an interview, but he'd been sick. He actually died before we were able to interview him. But his daughters reached out to us and gave us access. And so I spent many days in an attic going through boxes of files of his. Wow. He had I think it was 200 boxes of filing boxes full of stuff. And I ultimately got them transferred into an archive in Delaware. So they're now once they're processed, they'll be available in this archive. But no one collects these materials. For IETF and for contemporary W3C and so on, they're electronic records. But even ISO didn't do most of its work electronically until pretty recently. So getting records of all these is very hard. And that was an interesting aspect of this whole process, trying to track down where you get them. So Craig went to Sweden and talked to Ole Stern's family to get his records, and I talked to this EMC person's daughter.
We should maybe answer one other question at least.
So I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah. Oh no.
Let's see if there's one other short one that I could answer. I'm not sure. You're welcome, Adam. Thanks for being in on this. Adam was one of my students, I believe, many years ago.
No, I actually just completed my master's in the history of science, and I partly chose my thesis topic and looking at specifically at NIH granting mechanisms because I thought there will be records, and I know where they are.
Right. Typically, one does that, but in fact,
it's the federal government. There will be records.
There will be records, but there weren't necessarily on standards.
Yeah.
Maybe on that.
We can answer the Society for Motion Picture Intelligent Engineers. I mean, one of the standards that they
Mark DeCue's.
One of the standards that they started that actually became one of the few interwar standards accepted by the ISA was the standard for sound on film, which began with what is now the Society for Motion Picture Intelligent Engineers. And that's like if you talk about all of the standards, international standards between the wars, that's one of the most important ones.
But you're probably thinking of more recently. but the one we know of there is much earlier. So maybe on that note, I have really enjoyed the questions and the issues coming from you. And thank you all for sticking with this for so long, even on Zoom. Megan, would you like to close off?
Yeah, I guess it's.
Or do you want to leave it open for people to talk to each other?
It's 8:30 on the dot, and I think we have. I think our gracious host from the Alumni Association, Kim, has other things to do as well. So so just like to say thank you so much for both of you for sharing your expertise and letting us come into your home and.
Yes, indeed.
I've noticed a cat wandering around in the back.
I know. I did notice that. One of the two.
So that's this has been fantastic, and I know all of our the attendees have appreciated as well.
And if you can find a Smoot tape measure for me, I would love it.
I'm on that. I'm on that already.
Make it well worth my while.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much. And look forward to getting around to reading the book. And
yes, you saw this.
Yes, we saw that, and the link was in the email and on the in the email and on the website. And and I look forward to seeing people come back virtually for some more of our events coming up. And thank you all again. And yes, this has been recorded, and we will be putting this on our the MIT Club of Boston YouTube channel once we cleaned up.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.